I'd like to welcome Nick Turner, Chief Executive of Stratforma. Nick, tell us a little bit about what Stratforma does.
So Stratforma, we are an advisory boutique, so small but perfectly formed, working with senior executives to help them make better decisions in light of an uncertain future.
So every big company today feels that they're in this world which is changing perhaps faster than ever before, technological discontinuities, political and economic uncertainties. What are the types of ways that they should think about those challenges? How would you advise them at a very high level?
Sure. Well, I mean, the first thing, and the critical word you use there is think. They actually need to stop and think and take the time to think. Sadly, most executives in a very hectic, busy world are so focused on the here and now, they're so focused on the urgent, they struggle to take the time to think about the important. So step one is carve out time to think either by yourself or ideally with others about what's really shaping the future of your business, and think more strategically about what's important rather than just simply focusing and reacting to the urgent.
And I know that a big part of what you do is you work with companies on scenario planning. Can you just give us a kind of a quick and dirty kind of summary of how scenario planning works?
Sure. So scenario planning essentially is predicated on the fact that we actually can't predict the future. It's too uncertain. And therefore it's useful to think about multiple plausible futures in terms of what might happen, and therefore think about so what. So it's basically a process of having a creative, divergent set of conversations about what if, and then starting to converge around so what, why would we care if these features actually unfold, and then of course finally, most importantly, what actually would we do, what are the strategies, what are the options that we should pursue in light of having reviewed and thought through multiple plausible alternatives.
So take a kind of a real world example. Let's say we're a bank or a technology company, and we're looking at all these technological changes going on. We would try to predict how those technologies are going to play out and then say, what would this do for our competitive position?
So I tend to avoid using the word predict because the fundamental premise is you actually can't predict the future. And I get back to scenario planning is a great tool in terms of helping you to be roughly right rather than exactly wrong. And the danger of prediction is you get caught into the exactly wrong. So scenario thinking is very powerful in terms of it allows you to have a different type of conversation with your colleague, which is not predicated around I know, I believe, and I predict. And it's more about what if or let's imagine, which is a much more open and creative process, which allows you to explore different plausible alternatives before you then start focusing on how do we respond, how do we react, what are the options that we should be pursuing to be successful.
So if you are a company who's come up with a number of plausible alternatives, yes. It's very easy to kind of convince yourself that what you should be really doing is taking the most likely one of these and then putting all of your eggs in that basket. You come up with these low probability but often quite scary possibilities. You know, a lot of the banks, for example, might have said, you know, there could be a crisis coming up in 2007. How do we take seriously the idea that there's a low probability but very kind of challenging scenario out there? What do we do to prepare for that?
So, I mean, the first thing we're trying to do is avoid assigning probabilities to scenarios, because the danger of assigning probabilities is you get back to a single future view or essentially a prediction, and you lose the diversity of thinking and your rigor in your strategy development process. So I try and get clients and executives to think about betting on a strategy or a set of options rather than on a future per se. Now, that doesn't stop you having an informed point of view, and that view will be informed by thinking about multiple plausible scenarios, but from those you then start to divine a set of options and strategies that are within the risk parameters that you have as an organization and are going to enable you to be successful in a more robust set of outcomes.
And so in the case of a bank before the credit crisis, if you had a point of view that there could be a potential crisis looming, what sort of actions might that bank have taken to prepare for that possible future? So
we're talking about something that's obviously very close that's actually happened. And it was extremely challenging, I think, for any organization to really get their heads around what might happen if the music stopped and we saw a global financial crisis. In part because most organizations, most banks who were participating were being so successful and making so much money, and it's like a drug that they were participating in. So it was very hard from a kind of cultural and from a kind of cognitive bias perspective to get your head around the fact that the world might shift and stop. So that is extremely challenging when people are so focused on a set of outcomes that is so advantageous to them to imagine how a world may shift and change. And in scenario thinking, we call that the official future, right? It's a set of assumptions about how the future is going to work. But done well, scenarios should allow you to make what's implicit inside an organization or inside its culture explicit. And then you can start to look for vulnerabilities. You can start to look for tipping points. So let's imagine the world moves in this direction, or this particular variable changes this direction. What might happen, and therefore, how do we better prepare for that?
Right. So it makes us much more alert to possible changes, and hopefully, when we start to see evidence that some of these things might be coming true, that helps us to make actions ahead of our competitors, because ultimately what we're trying to do is to do these things, better than the people around us. Is that
correct? And I think one of the most important parts of the scenario planning process actually is to identify those so-called early warning signals or indicators that show that the world is shifting in a different way. And unfortunately, most organizations underinvest both in terms of identifying those signals and to actually monitoring them. And so when we see scenario planning underperform or fail, it's because we're not making those investments in that horizon scanning capability and technologies.
One last question. A lot of people I talk to about scenario planning say, we ran these beautiful scenarios, we had all these workshops, we came up with some interesting points of view, and then nothing happened. I mean, you touched on this, but help us think about the way that we take those scenarios and then turn them into practical, actionable things for executives who are running line businesses to actually work on.
Yeah, so that is true, and unfortunately it's true of virtually all strategies. Is often that they're great articulated, pretty PowerPoint charts and reports, but sit on the shelf and gather dust. I think how scenarios can be different and be more successful is one is the engagement process. So if you actually have the key stakeholders involved in the process of developing the scenarios, rather than being done by a third party or an external team, it helps to inform their intuition. It becomes a very visceral process that they are brought into and actually engage with in terms of creating. So it's their set of scenarios, and they actually live and understand the implications and the importance of taking action. So at the end of the day, there's no substitute for executive action. There's no substitute for senior sponsorship. There's no substitute for the responsibility and rigor and discipline of taking action on the back of a strategy exercise.
Thank you very much.